May 4, 2025. The wind screamed across the Himalayas, tearing through the tents at Camp 2 on Makalu, one of the deadliest peaks on Earth. Inside one of those tents sat a man who had already beaten death once. His name was Alexander Panko. At 19, he stared cancer in the face and won. At 35, he stood on top of the world, literally, having conquered Mount Everest. And now, at 39, he returned to the mountains for what would become his final climb. He wasn't supposed to die there, not after everything he'd overcome. But that's the cruel mystery of the high places. They take not just the reckless or the unprepared, but sometimes the strongest souls who dared to dream too big. What makes a man who already survived death climb straight back into it? Was it pride, purpose, or something far deeper? Something the rest of us spend our lives running away from. Tonight, we follow Alexander's extraordinary journey, from a hospital bed in Chicago to the frozen summit of the world. And finally, to the place where his heart stopped beating at 21,000 feet. This isn't just a story about mountaineering. It's a story about why we climb at all, about life, purpose, and the quiet battle between courage and fate. If you believe some stories are meant to be remembered, not for how they end, but for how deeply they make us feel, then hit subscribe and stay with us. Because tonight on Ben's Stories we climb with Alexander Panko, the man who beat cancer and then climbed into his own death. Before the storm and the silence, there was laughter. 19-year-old Alexander Panko had no reason to think his life would ever stop being ordinary. He was a finance student in Chicago, smart, ambitious, and maybe a little too addicted to caffeine and late-night study sessions. But then came the headaches, the kind that start as a whisper and end as a scream. At first, he brushed them off. Stress, maybe lack of sleep. But soon they were bad enough to stop him mid-sentence, to make him grab his head in pain while pretending to laugh it off in front of friends. When the dizziness came, he finally went to the hospital. Lurie Children's Hospital, Chicago. What started as a quick scan turned into a quiet conversation in a cold room. "Alexander, we found something." The words no one ever wants to hear. It was a brain tumor. Not cancerous, the doctors said, but serious enough to need surgery, immediately. For a 19-year-old, it might as well have been the end of the world. He lay there in that sterile room, listening to the rhythmic beeping of machines, wondering what would happen next. Would he ever go back to college? Would he ever travel, get married, build a life? The surgery was long, complicated, but Alexander survived. And in the weeks that followed, as he lay recovering, he made himself a quiet promise that if he ever got another chance to live, he would really live. 9 years later, he had everything people dream of. A degree, a well-paying job in finance, a corner desk with a skyline view. But every morning when he looked at himself in the mirror, something inside whispered, "Is this it?" He'd escaped death, only to find himself trapped in routine. Then one summer, he took a trip, a safari in Africa. It was supposed to be just a vacation, but when he stood there watching herds of elephants move under a golden sunrise, something inside him shifted. Everything around him was wild, raw, alive. And for the first time since that hospital bed, so was he. That's when he made the decision that would change everything. He would climb Mount Kilimanjaro. It sounded ridiculous. He wasn't an athlete, hadn't trained, hadn't even owned hiking boots. But that's why he wanted it. Because it was impossible. And impossible to Alexander meant worth it. The first runs nearly killed him. Chicago's thin park trails felt endless. His lungs burned, his legs shook, but every time he wanted to quit, he remembered lying helpless in that hospital bed. Back then, his body had failed him. Now, he would train it to obey. Over the months, he started hiking the 14,000-foot peaks of Colorado, feeling the old strength return, the thrill of doing something hard, something real. And finally, in 2016, he stood at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro, Africa's tallest mountain, 19,341 feet of ice, rock, and thin air. It wasn't just a climb, it was a test of body, mind, and soul. The early trails were deceiving. Warm air, lush forest, a rhythm of laughter among strangers who'd soon become companions. But as they climbed, the world changed. The air thinned. The nights grew cold. Headaches returned, dull, pounding, familiar. The same kind that once warned him of a tumor. Only this time, he didn't run to doctors. He kept walking, step after step, breath after breath. And when he finally reached Uhuru Peak, the roof of Africa, he stood watching the clouds drift beneath his feet. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not after the tumor. Not after everything. But he was. And in that silence, above the world, above every fear, Alexander realized this wasn't the end of his journey. It was the beginning. He thought, if one mountain could make me feel this alive, what would 7 do? That night, while the other climbers celebrated, Alexander sat alone, staring into the stars, already dreaming of bigger mountains. Mountains like Everest, like Denali, and maybe even the poles themselves. Because when you've already beaten death once, sometimes you stop fearing how far you might fall. When Alexander returned home from Africa, the world looked smaller. The morning commute, the boardroom chatter, the city lights that once felt electric, all of it suddenly felt muted. He'd tasted something higher, purer, and he couldn't forget it. It began as a whisper in the back of his mind. One summit wasn't enough. He needed something bigger, harder, something that demanded every ounce of his body and spirit. That whisper turned into a plan. The Explorer's Grand Slam. The 7 highest peaks on each continent, plus skiing the final degrees to both the North and South Poles. A challenge so extreme that fewer than 100 people in history had ever completed it. But Alexander wasn't chasing a record. He was chasing meaning. He decided every climb would be dedicated to Lurie Children's Hospital, the place that had once saved his life. His goal, raise $1 million for pediatric neuroscience research, one mountain at a time. He mapped everything meticulously, the way he once studied financial charts. Gear lists, weather windows, training cycles, oxygen management, altitude acclimatization. Every mountain would be a different world. Antarctica's frozen silence, the volcanic slopes of Elbrus, the brutal ridges of Denali. He had 5 years to make it all happen, and nothing could go wrong. Until something did. It was a clear Colorado morning in 2017. Alexander was climbing Snowmass Mountain, one of the state's famed 14,000-foot peaks. He'd done this before, training climbs, solo ascents, quick summits. But that day, he wanted to test himself. He went light, minimal gear, speed over safety. Somewhere on the descent, his boot slipped on loose shale. He tumbled. Sharp rock tore through his calf, deep, clean to the bone. The blood came fast, soaking his pant leg, painting the snow beneath him red. There was no one around, no signal, no shelter. Just the high-altitude silence and his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. He knew what it meant. If he didn't act fast, he would bleed out before nightfall. With shaking hands, he tore a strip from his jacket and wrapped it tight around his leg, pressing down hard to stop the bleeding. Pain roared through him, white-hot and merciless. For hours he crawled down the slope, dragging himself toward the faint signal from his radio beacon. Finally, he reached a spot high enough for a signal to break through. Minutes later, the sound of a Black Hawk helicopter thundered above the mountain. The Aspen Mountain Rescue Team and the Colorado High Altitude Army National Guard hoisted him up. He was alive, but barely. At the hospital, doctors warned him, "You're lucky. You might lose the leg. You might never walk normally again." For most people, that would have been the end of their mountaineering dreams. For Alexander, it was another beginning. 6 weeks later. 6 weeks. He was climbing Cho-Oyu, the world's 6th highest mountain, standing on the border of Tibet and Nepal. His leg wasn't fully healed. The scar was fresh, deep, but his will was stronger. Every step on that ice felt like a promise. To himself, to the hospital, to every child lying in a hospital bed wondering if they'd ever stand again. From there, the years blurred into one endless climb. Mount Elbrus in Europe, Aconcagua in South America, Vinson Massif in Antarctica. Each peak tested him, stripped him down, rebuilt him stronger. In Antarctica, the world turned into an endless white desert. The sun never set, but it gave no warmth. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots against the frozen ground. He often said that Antarctica felt like standing at the edge of the universe, where the earth itself seemed to end. And yet even there, he felt alive. By 2018, Alexander had completed 5 of the 7 summits. Only Everest and Denali remained. Everest, the crown jewel, the killer, the place where one wrong step could turn triumph into tragedy. But Alexander wasn't just climbing it for himself. He was climbing for Serena Lewis, a 15-year-old girl he'd met through Lurie Hospital. Serena was fighting her own impossible mountain, a rare neurological disorder that kept her in and out of surgery. She'd once told Alexander, "You climbed out of the hospital. Maybe one day I will too." Those words stuck with him. He decided that when he reached the top of the world, he'd carry her name with him. And so in the spring of 2019, Alexander joined an expedition to Mount Everest. The first challenge was the Khumbu Icefall, a labyrinth of ice towers and crevasses that shift without warning. He described it later as walking through a graveyard made of glass. Beyond that lay the western CWM, a valley so bright under the sun that climbers called it the Valley of Silence. Then came the Lhotse face, an endless wall of blue ice so steep it felt like climbing a frozen skyscraper. At each step, his body screamed. His lungs burned. His heartbeat pounded in his ears like a war drum. But he kept thinking of Serena, of the girl who couldn't run or climb, but never gave up. He reached the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the body begins to die faster than it can heal. Oxygen was scarce. Frostbite gnawed at his fingers. Still, he moved. On May 23, 2019, Alexander Panko stood on the summit of Mount Everest. He pulled a small patch from his jacket, a hospital logo with Serena's name written on the back, and raised it toward the wind. He had done it. For Serena, for every child still fighting, and for the boy who once lay in a hospital bed wondering if he would ever stand again. That moment was supposed to be the end. The perfect conclusion to an impossible journey. But Alexander wasn't finished. Not yet. Because he had one last summit waiting. Denali. And what happened next would complete his legend and begin his final climb toward tragedy. Alaska, 2021. The world was still reeling from the pandemic, but on the icy spine of North America's tallest mountain, none of that mattered. Here, the air was thin, the wind merciless, and the rules simple. Climb or die trying. Denali, 20,910 feet of raw, frozen cruelty. Unlike Everest, there are no Sherpas, no fixed ropes, no bottled oxygen. Every ounce of gear, every bite of food, every shred of hope, you carry it yourself. Alexander knew it. He'd read the statistics. 1 in 3 climbers turn back. 1 in 6 never make it home. Still, he smiled as he loaded his pack. He was finally here. The last mountain of his 7 summits dream. The one that would complete his $1 million mission for the Children's Hospital. The team consisted of 4 climbers, Alexander, 2 Alaskans, and a British alpinist named Tom Hall, a man known for his brutal honesty and unmatched endurance. From base camp at 7,200 feet, the mountain looked deceptively peaceful, like a sleeping giant draped in sunlight. But veterans knew better. Denali's calm face could turn savage in minutes. The climb began well. The group moved steadily up to Camp 1, then Camp 2, hauling heavy sleds across the endless white glacier. At night, the sky burned with colors, ribbons of green and violet flickering like ghosts across the Arctic sky. Sometimes Alexander would just stand there, staring at them, whispering, "If heaven had windows, they'd look like this." But the peace didn't last. By the time they reached 14,000 feet, the winds began to howl. Forecasts warned of an approaching Arctic cyclone, one of the worst in a decade. Teams began turning back. Radios crackled with calls from climbers abandoning their ascents. Tom Hall looked at Alexander and asked quietly, "We still going up?" Alexander hesitated. He'd been here before, on the edge between logic and obsession. He thought of the children waiting back in Chicago, the donations still coming in, the final video message he'd recorded, promising to complete the 7 summits, no matter what. He met Tom's eyes and said, "We go, but we go smart." They pressed on toward High Camp, carrying just enough supplies for a 2-day window. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees. The world shrank to a blur of white and noise. By nightfall, they reached 17,000 feet, a windswept ridge where tents shredded like paper if you didn't anchor them right. Tom and the Alaskans secured the guy lines, while Alexander boiled snow for water. Inside the tent, the sound of the wind was deafening, a deep, continuous roar that made the walls shudder. They ate freeze-dried meals in silence. No one said it out loud, but they all knew. This might be their only chance. At 3 a.m., the wind eased, the sky cleared. They decided to push for the summit, the final climb. The air was so thin, it felt like breathing through a straw. Frost clung to their eyelashes. Every exhale turned to a crystal mist that froze on their jackets. They climbed in silence, heads down, ropes taut between them. Step, breathe, step, breathe. A rhythm as old as the mountains themselves. Hours passed. The sun crept higher, turning the snow into a blinding mirror. The ridge narrowed, the world falling away on both sides. Then came Pig Hill, the final brutal slope to the summit plateau. It looked short. It wasn't. Halfway up, Tom collapsed to one knee, gasping. "Too cold," he muttered. "I can't feel my hands." Alexander turned back, eyes full of determination. "Come on," he said. "We're almost there." He pulled Tom up, wrapping his arm around his shoulder, forcing him forward step by step. At 12:47 p.m., after 10 hours of climbing, they reached the top of North America, Denali Summit. Alexander dropped to his knees, breathing hard, tears freezing to his face. He pulled out a small flag, white with the blue Lurie Hospital logo, and planted it in the snow. "For Serena," he whispered. "For the fight that never ends." The others cheered faintly, snapped photos, and turned to begin their descent. They'd done it. The 7 summits. $1 million raised. The dream complete. But Denali wasn't done with them. As they began descending, clouds rolled in from the north, thick, gray, fast-moving. The wind picked up again, harder than before. Snow began to fall, light at first, then in sheets so heavy they could barely see their own boots. Visibility dropped to 0. The rope between them twisted in the wind like a snake. Tom shouted something, but the storm swallowed his words. Then came a sharp crack, the sound of a cornice breaking. Alexander turned just in time to see one of the Alaskans vanish into white. The rope went tight, yanking Alexander off balance. He slammed into the slope, ice axe barely catching in time. "Cut the rope," Tom screamed. Alexander hesitated. He could feel the dead weight pulling them toward the abyss. But if he cut it, he closed his eyes. Then, slowly, the tension eased. The rope went slack. The mountain had made the decision for him. They staggered back toward High Camp through the storm, blinded, half-frozen, navigating by instinct alone. Hours later, they stumbled into camp, 3 men where 4 had started, exhausted, hollow, silent. Inside his tent, Alexander sat motionless, staring at the frost forming on the fabric walls. He'd finished his mission. He'd survived. But something in him had changed. He wrote in his journal that night, "I thought this climb would give me peace. Instead, it gave me questions. Maybe the real mountain isn't out there at all." When he returned home to Chicago, the world hailed him as a hero. News outlets ran headlines like, "Cancer survivor conquers the 7 summits." He smiled for cameras, shook hands, gave interviews. But behind the smile, friends noticed the same thing. Alexander wasn't really back. Part of him was still up there, in the storm, on that white ridge, staring into something none of us could see. And that part would call him again. Harder than before. This time, from a place even higher. and far more unforgiving. It was 2025, and the mountains were calling again. But this time, not Everest, not Denali, not for glory or $1 million campaign. This time, it was Makalu, the fifth highest peak in the world, a mountain that looked like a blade thrust into the sky, cold, perfect, and merciless. For Alexander, it wasn't about records anymore. He didn't tell sponsors. He didn't post updates. He simply said to a friend, "I need to go back. One last climb. For me." Some believed he was searching for peace. Others thought he was running from something. Maybe the emptiness that comes after you. Have done everything you ever dreamed of. Whatever it was, he couldn't stay away. He joined a small mixed expedition, 6 climbers from 4 countries. Among them was Anya Petrov, a quiet Russian alpinist who had lost her husband on Annapurna years before. She and Alexander bonded quickly, their conversations soft, almost reverent. Both understood what it meant to lose people to the mountains, and still love them anyway. April 2025. The team set up base camp at 15,000 feet. Makalu loomed above them like a cathedral of ice. Every morning Alexander woke before dawn. He'd sit outside his tent sipping instant coffee, staring at the black silhouette of the mountain as the sun rose behind it. He'd murmur, "Still here," like he was answering a voice no one else could hear. The climb began smoothly, up to Camp 1, Camp 2, then Camp 3. The team moved efficiently, laughing between climbs, sharing freeze-dried meals and stories of home. But the higher they went, the more the world seemed to fade. Voices grew quieter, breaths shorter. At 21,000 feet, time itself slowed down. Alexander grew quieter too. He moved methodically as if every step were both a duty and a confession. Anya once caught him staring off toward the horizon for a long time, lost in thought. When she asked what he was thinking, he simply said, "You ever feel like the mountain remembers you?" By early May, weather forecasts showed a narrow summit window. One day of clear skies before another storm front moved in. They decided to go for it. At Camp 4, Alexander's oxygen regulator began to malfunction. It hissed unevenly, leaking precious air. Tom Hall, his old Denali partner, had warned him once. "Up here, a bad regulator is a death sentence." But Alexander didn't turn back. He adjusted the flow manually, told no one, and pressed on. They began the final push at midnight. The moon hung low, the snow reflecting its pale light like shards of glass. Every breath was labor. Every heartbeat sounded like thunder inside his chest. Halfway up, at 26,000 feet, one climber turned back, frostbitten and exhausted. Anya stayed close behind Alexander, keeping pace through the howling wind. "You good?" she shouted. "Always," he replied, forcing a smile. But his regulator hissed louder now, like a serpent coiling tighter. His vision blurred. He stumbled once, catching himself with his axe, panting hard. Anya saw the color draining from his face. "We should go down," she urged. "After the summit," he whispered. "We're too close." May 4th, 2025. At 10:46 a.m., Alexander reached the summit of Makalu. No cheering, no radio calls. Just silence and the soft crackle of wind moving through eternity. He looked out over the Himalayas, the same ridges where he'd stood years ago on Everest. He pulled a small photo from his jacket. Serena, smiling, holding a "Keep Climbing" sign drawn in crayon. He pressed it against his chest, whispering, "We did it, kid." Then he sat down. Anya reached him minutes later. She saw his face, peaceful, almost radiant, his lips blue. He looked at her and said, barely audible through the mask, "It's beautiful up here, isn't it?" And then he went still. Anya screamed his name, shaking him, but the thin air swallowed her voice. His body slumped, unmoving. The regulator lay silent beside him, his oxygen tank empty. The team tried for hours to bring him down. But Makalu doesn't forgive. The weather turned. Winds roared again. Temperatures dropped to 45 degrees. They had no choice. They wrapped him in his sleeping bag, anchored him in the snow, and said their goodbyes. Anya left a note tucked inside his jacket. You found your peace, my friend. The mountain remembers. Then she descended. Alone. Weeks later, his body was spotted by another expedition, still seated facing the horizon as if watching the sunrise. The news spread quickly. Headlines read, "Cancer survivor, Everest hero, dies on Makalu summit." Social media mourned. The hospital released a statement honoring his $1 million legacy. But the people who knew him best said something different. "He didn't die chasing glory," Tom Hall said in an interview. "He died chasing the silence he could only find above the clouds." Yet something about his story didn't end there. Because 3 weeks later, Anya's GoPro footage surfaced, footage showing the final hour of the climb. And what it revealed changed everything. The recovered GoPro footage began with a trembling view of the summit. The camera wobbled, strapped to Anya's chest. We see Alexander sitting near the prayer flags, the wind tearing at his parka. He isn't gasping or panicked. He's calm, almost too calm. Then, a voice. His. Barely audible through the mask. "I've been waiting for this moment since the first climb." Anya's voice trembles. "Alex, your oxygen. It's empty." He smiles faintly. "I know." He takes off his mask, exhales one long, visible breath, and looks toward the horizon. "You can't beat death twice," he says softly. "But maybe you can make peace with it." The camera catches his hand as he pulls a folded note from his jacket and presses it into Anya's glove. "If I don't make it down, tell them I wasn't lost." Then, he leans back, eyes half closed, and whispers something almost carried away by the wind. "I climbed to live, and I lived enough." And then, silence. The footage ends there. When Anya returned to base camp, she handed the note to the team leader. Later, it was delivered to Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. Inside, written in Alexander's uneven handwriting, were just a few lines. "Don't mourn the climb. Every mountain I faced was already inside me. If the children ever ask why I didn't stop, tell them at USS because hope never stops climbing." That note now hangs in a glass frame in the hospital lobby, next to photos of Alexander with young patients, smiling, laughing, alive. Every year since, the hospital holds a Panko summit walk. Children in wheelchairs on crutches with IV poles circle the courtyard 10 times. On the last lap, they raise their hands and shout, "Keep climbing, Alex." Maybe Alexander Panko didn't die searching for peace. Maybe he found it, up there, where the world ends and the sky begins. And maybe that's what the mountains do. They don't kill us. They just remind us how small we are. And how beautiful it is to be alive, even for a moment. If this story moved you, if you believe some lives echo beyond the summits, then don't let it fade. Subscribe to Ben's Stories, where we remember the climbers, the dreamers, the souls who touch the sky, and teach us what it means to never stop climbing.